I went a little bit old school here, and I have a handout. We've already heard about a lot of historic Jewish controversies that Rav Hofman has been involved in. The biblical criticism and the divine authorship of the Torah, the origins of Torah Shebaal Peh, attitudes towards Christianity, and now we're really going to get into the deep end of controversy in discussing some of Rav Hofman's positions on Kitniot on Pesach for Ashkenazim. As a test case for his halachic development. It's important to note, by the way, that this is everything that I'm going to be presenting here. This is work that I've done together with Dr. Tova Genzel. We submitted an article not long ago that's related to this. This is another. This is a case that came to light after we had already submitted that article, and so we're going with. You know, even though I'm speaking, this material was developed jointly by Tova and I. Among scholars and writers who have addressed Rav David Tzvi Hofman's halachic writings, everyone has treated his halachic works synchronically, meaning as all happening at the same time and not diachronically, without tracing any sort of development from one time period to another, from one period of his life to another, and for good reason. As several of them have noted, there's almost a complete absence of dates in Sheilot Utshuvot Melamed Lahoil. Which makes it impossible to chart Rav Hofman's development. I'll quote from an article by Daniel Gordis, Dr. Daniel Gordis, who wrote his dissertation on Rav Hofman. He writes, unlike many poskim, he neglected to date his tshuvot, making it virtually impossible to trace the development of his thought on a given issue. So over the past few months, Dr. Genzel and I have begun conducting some research which will demonstrate that, in fact, we can specify or at least approximate the dating of nearly all of the responsa in Melamed Lahoil. And this carries significant implications for any future work on Rav Hofman's halachic writings. And it also invites us to revisit some of the conclusions drawn using this synchronic approach. By way of background, to understand what methods we're using to reconstruct the timeline of Rav Hofman's Sheilot Utshuvot, his responsa. So firstly, it's important to note how Melamed Lahoil, the printed Melamed Lahoil that we have in our hands today, how that came about. How was it composed? So the story begins on Rav Hofman's 48th birthday in 1891. His son gave him a birthday present, a notebook. And in this notebook, Rav Hofman began to write and record all kinds of things. Shiurim that he gave, drashot that he gave, chidushim that he had, and also halachic responsa. He added to this notebook chronologically, meaning he would add things as they came up, as he thought of them, or as he composed them, over the course of the next 20 years when he actually ran out of room in that notebook and had to start another one. That notebook has approximately 370 entries, and he numbers them, 1 through 370. Of the 373 responsa, and that's a coincidence that there's about the same number of responsa in Melamed Lahoil as there are in the notebook, because only 233 of the responsa in Melamed Lahoil, in the printed Melamed Lahoil, come from the notebook. According to Shlomo Hoffman, who is here, he was here. He'll be back. He'll be back, according to his calculation. So, essentially, the publishers, Rav Hofman's son, took the notebook, took what they thought was the relevant halachic material, those 233 responsa, together with another 1/3, another 150 responsa or so, and rearranged it thematically so that all of Hilchot Pesach is together and all of Hilchot Shabbat is together and all of Hilchot Gittin is together, and produced the book. But in doing so, they deleted the order, the original order in which it appeared in the notebook, which was chronological. So if you look at the printed Melamed Lahoil, you would have no way of knowing which tshuvot come before any others. In the notebook, there are approximately 20 entries that contain dates. Right? And we're talking about over the course of 18 years. So for the most part, they're not dated, but there are about 18 to 20 that are dated, which means that on average, you're going to have intervals of approximately a year between dates, which means that any tshuva in between, you can locate, you can time any tshuva in between the two tshuvot that are dated, the one before it that has a date, and the closest one before it that has a date, and the closest one after it that has a date. So every tshuva can be limited to a year or two, sometimes 3. So you can narrow the time frame of any tshuva. The notebook still exists. I viewed it, Dr. Ganzel has viewed it, and once again, we thank the Hofmann family for allowing us to consult it. That's one part. That's one way that we reconstruct. The second way that we reconstruct is that Rav Hofmann actually kept up a significant correspondence with a lot of people in his era, halachic correspondence, all kinds of correspondence, and many of his responses can be found, sometimes it's like a postcard, right? This is before you had shoot SMS, you had shoot postcard. So Rav Hofmann is writing on these postcards, and these are found in collections around the world. We've found in Yeshiva University, obviously at the National Library of Israel and Israel's National Archives, but also in private collections in Switzerland, in England, and more of this stuff is becoming available all the time. In fact, some of the material that you have in front of you, we copied it from things that went online on auction sites recently, meaning these artifacts are being auctioned as rare Judaica, and they put up nice high-definition pictures of these letters that they're selling, and we saved those images and we use them, right? I mean, we don't think of that as a source for Jewish studies, but it is a source for Jewish studies, right? These auction sites that are scanning high-definition letters written by various personages. It's a source, and it's a source that we would do well to avail ourselves of. So, some of these responsa have no parallel. Some of the responsa that we have found in the in these archives have no parallels in Melamed Lahoil, right? And those were published. Many of them, I would say most of them, were published by Mark Shapiro in an article from 1996 or 1997. But many of them do have parallels, and it's actually, when we first discovered them, we were like, oh, there's all these unpublished tshuvot from Rav Hofmann, we should publish them. And then we saw that Mark Shapiro had published them. And then we started thinking, wait a second. If we look at the ones that have been published and we look at the parallels, meaning, is this tshuva the same as the tshuva that appears in the printed edition of Melamed Lahoil? And we started to notice some significant differences, and that's the genesis of this article. By cross-referencing, in terms of the timing, by cross-referencing these responsa with the responsa in the notebook, we see that sometimes Rav Hofmann entered his ruling into the notebook and wrote the responsum letter, the letter that he actually sent by post, at around the same time. So if you have two versions of the same tshuva, one of which is in the notebook and one of which was, has an actual postmark on it, then you can actually date that tshuva to a very specific time, sometimes even to a precise date. In addition, as opposed to the notebook, the letters have the names of the addressees, the letters have obviously dates, so this makes it easier, it makes it possible for us to understand what the context was when and to whom Rav Hoffman was writing. And another point, and I'm mentioning this, it doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about today, but it's the most fascinating thing that you see is that Rav Hoffman continued to update his response in his notebook. He didn't write the tshuva at a certain date and then never go back to it. He continued to update it throughout his life, and we even have instances where in the last year of his life, he was updating tshuvot that he had written 15 years before. Obviously, he had no access or no easy access to things that he had already sent away in the mail. So you have, in some cases, where the tshuva that was sent in the mail is almost a first draft, and it's not even a draft. It's actually, he sent it. This was the tshuva that he responded. But that was the tshuva version 1.0. Sometimes you have a version 2.0, and we've even seen instances where you have up to 4.0, where he subtly shifts, subtly changes, or even completely reverses his earlier position. Two of those cases where he changes his position we addressed in the article that we've already written and submitted. And the last one, we're going to discuss here. Thus, in conclusion, the vast majority of response in Melamed Lahoil can be dated with varying degrees of precision, and David Tzvi Hoffman's development as a posek can indeed be traced. Now we're going to demonstrate that with one particular example, and that is the example of sesame oil on Pesach, right? Because once again, the question of kitniot is always one everybody has an opinion about it. So, the question was, can sesame oil, cold-pressed sesame oil, dry-pressed sesame oil, be used on Pesach by Ashkenazim? Now, if you open the printed Melamed Lahoil, you will find that this is addressed in two places, which is really three places. Chelik Aleph, Simanim Pei Zayin, Pei Chet, Volume 1 of Melamed Lahoil, responsa numbers 87 and 88. The first one, number 87, Pei Zayin, has two parts, right? And that's on the sheets in front of you. In the first part, you see there's the She'ela, Ishum Shemin Hu Zezam, right? Shum Shemin, which is sesame b'lashon Ashkenaz, Yavi Kitniot. Oh, sorry, it's two questions. Is Shum Shemin Zezam, and is it Kitniot? And can you use it on Pesach? And he says, Bilti Safek Shum Shemin Hu Zezam. Earlier we asked, we heard from the dean who asked whether or not we can have any, if there's any connection where we could bring Radat Hoffman into the Middle East and into the Mediterranean context. The answer is obviously that we can. He did have a PhD. His PhD was in Semitic languages, and throughout his tshuvot, he will often look for cognates in Semitic languages. And here's one example: Nikra Bilashon Aravi al Sum Sum. Right? Sesame is sesame. Zezam in German, al Sum Sum in Arabic. In this tshuva, he says that on one hand we have different attestations. Some say that they do eat it, some say that they don't eat it, but he comes out machmir. He says, no, we don't eat it. It's included in the category of kitniot, and because some people say that you're not allowed to, and you're not even allowed to use it as fuel because it has grain mixed in, so it has a chashash, and ulfizeh yesh lahachmir b'shum shemin b'sum shemin kivekitniot ubefrat shedomek tzat la'adashi. Fine. He gives his reasons, and he says that we don't use sesame on Pesach, we Ashkenazim. And then he has another document that's copied into the tshuva. Or he actually writes where it says ha'atek. That's actually Radat's writing now. And it's actually there in the notebook. Ha'atek. He copies out a letter that he received from a student or a colleague who was based in Jerusalem named Rabbi Eliezer Greenhut, who was the director of an orphanage in Jerusalem. And Rav Greenhut had said, he said, Masha bikesh hagaon lahodio, you asked me to let you know what's the minhag of the Ashkenazim here. And he says, the minhag here amongst the Ashkenazim is that it's usher to use kitniot on Pesach. Right? And you would assume from there, yes, that you expect that there's a letter here that we don't have. Right? That there's a letter that Rav Hoffman sent to Rav Grunhut, asking what the story is in Yerushalayim. The second place in Melamed Laho'il that addresses it is in the very next responsum. There he's dealing with the question of peanut oil, and he's more makil, and he's giving his reasons for being makil, and he says, towards the end, he says, Alzeh kvar horez zakein. He says, even though he compares it to the case of sesame oil, and he says, Alzeh kvar horez zakein, Morenu harav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch Zatzal bepapdam befrankfurt demain lahatir shemen sumsimin. Va'af shebeshemen sumsimin shepashat aminag be'eretz Yisrael v'shar aratzos le'isur lo mala'ani libi lahatir. He says, so first of all, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who he doesn't mention in his first tshuva, said it's okay to use sesame oil. But I, lo mala'ani libi lahatir. I'm uncomfortable saying that it's mutter, and then he writes achar kach, right? And this seems that this is some sort of addition later. Shomati, I heard, meaning I didn't see it inside, but I heard shahagon de kavna, right? That Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, b'sefer be'er Yitzchak hitir shemen sumzimin. That he heard that Rav Yitzchak Elchanan was matir. These are the only two treatments of the issue in Melamed Laho'il. In the simanim, in the notebook, what we have as siman pei zayin was actually two simanim. They're close to each other, but they're not adjacent. One of them is siman reish pei chet, and the other one is reish tzadik bet. Right? It's 288 and 292, which means that they were written close to each other in time, but not at the exact same time. Presumably within a few weeks or months of each other. It would seem that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, what seems to be clear here is that Rav Hoffman wrote his own responsum, then sent off his letter to Rav Greenhut. When he got his response from Rav Greenhut, he wrote it, he copied it over into his notebook, so that would be part of the same treatment. And indeed, when it was printed, these two entries in the notebook were combined into a single tshuva. Based on the dates in the notebook, we can actually narrow it down. We can narrow down these two simanim to the years between 1903 and 1905. That's when he was dealing with this issue. Okay? Ad kan, based on the information that we have from the two tshuvot and from the notebook. The other responsum, siman peichet, it does not appear in the notebook at all, so we can't really say much about it. It is curious, though, that as I mentioned, that Rav Hirsch and Rav Spector are not mentioned at all in the first responsum. And we don't know if that's only because he learned of their views later on, or we don't know whether his view is softening in the second tshuva, or whether this was an earlier tshuva and his view is actually hardening. We don't know at this point. A more complete picture emerges from 3 additional documents. 2 of them are postcards that were sent from Rav Hoffman to Rav Grunhut in Jerusalem, and the third document is a newspaper article that was published by Rav Grunhut. So we'll present them in chronological order. The first one, in the letter to Rav Grunhut, so you have it in front of you. It's kind of hard to read, number 1, because it's handwritten, and number 2, because it's, you can see it, but it's hard to make out. So after an introductory paragraph, over here is where Rav Hoffman starts to write, and you can see the date. You can see that the date is Parshat Miketz, Motzei Shabbat mi Parshat Miketz, Taf Reish Samach Dalet. So we're talking about towards the end, the tail end of the year 1903, which is exactly where we said it should be, based on the notebook. Okay? I have a question for you. And then he goes through his whole thing. He goes through the Arabic, sesame, that whole thing. And then about 5 lines from the bottom, right, that's where Shon Arabi al Sum Sum, the hatargum shemitargumin be'Ungarin of Russia, and the translation that they use in Hungary and in Russia, mon, that when the Mishnah talks about sumsumin, it means mon, it means poppy, ta'ud hu ta'ud. That's a mistake, and he's right. That's a mistake. So he says, having established that sumsumin is sesame, I have 4 questions. What do the Ashkenazim do in Yerushalayim? The people that are Meikil, who are they basing it on? Why? What's their rationale? And are the Ashkenazim a little bit more lax because they're living in Yerushalayim, they are exposed to Sephardim? It's sort of familiar for us today, right? That when different communities, live side by side, there's a little bit of a bleeding of the minhagim of one group into the other. So is that why Ashkenazim in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, started to consume shemen sumsumin on Pesach? Is it because they're influenced by the Sephardim? Those are the questions that he asked. So now that fills in one little gap, which is we now have the bridge between the 2 parts of the first tshuva, right? The first part of the tshuva is Rav Hoffman's own writing. Then he writes this particular letter to Rav Grunhut. He gets his response from Rav Grunhut, and he copies that as well into his notebook. Now, the second document is part of a much larger issue. Now, we know that Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of mandatory Palestine, first chief rabbi of Israel, was a controversial figure. That he was not, there were a lot of things that he stood for that were not appreciated particularly by people within the old Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. Now, one of the most famous controversies that he got involved in was the controversy over Heter Mechira, about what to do on Shemitah, whether or not you could create a fictitious sale. Another one of the major controversies that he got into was he gave a hashkacha, kosher lepesach, KFP, to a factory, a plant in Yafo that was producing sesame oil for Pesach. And he said you can use it on Pesach because it's a completely dry and cold process. There's no way that anything else could get mixed in. So now when he did this, it created a huge controversy, especially in Yerushalayim. There are some excellent articles on that. We don't need to get into that now, but Rav Hoffman got dragged into this controversy in a journal, in a newspaper that was published in Yerushalayim called Chavatzelet, right before Pesach, right, in the issue of March 31st, 1909, right, so this is about 5.5 years after the initial exchange with Rav Grunhut. He says, Rav Grunhut writes into this newspaper, and he says, about 10 years ago, okay, he was off by a couple of years, Nish'al harav, morenu harav, David Tzvi Hofman, Nero Yair, Rosh Beit HaMidrash HaRabbanim, Be'ir HaBirah Berlin, and he talks about, Baki b'chadrei Torah, b'shas, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifrei Tosefta, im mutar la'asot shemen sumsumin b'Pesach, right? He asked me, right? And now the more he says about Rav David Tzvi Hofman, the more he's saying about himself, right? It's like, this guy asked me a question, right? So he asked me, I told him what I thought. Ashivehu davar ki azkenim sheba'oto azman nishmatam eden amru li shebe'ir hakodesh tibanev v'tikonin b'mehera ein noagin bo heter. No, we don't eat sesame oil in Yerushalayim on Pesach. Muvan memela ki gam harav nero ya'ir. So obviously, Rav Hoffman himself, mashach et yadod milahatiro. He refused to be matir it. So he's weighing in, and now he continues on. V'zeh kolefnei chodesh yamim hodieni ki nimtza po be'irenu akadosh shemen sumsumin shel Pesach. Right? He starts to say that this was the minhag here. Radat Hoffman said that it's not okay to use this, and now all of a sudden comes this Johnny come lately and says that it's okay to use, to give a hashkacha, who comes and gives a hashkacha on it on Pesach. Okay, coming to the end. Not a month later, right, and if you look at the last source in the source sheet, you see that it says, Yud Bet, it says Chav Hei Nisan, the 25th of Nisan, Yud Bet Liminyan B'nei Yisrael, right, the 12th day of the Omer, Taf Reish Samach Tet, 1909. So this is about a month after, Rav Grunhut publishes his article in Chavat Selet, and he says, Shalom V'chol Tov Sela L'Harav Hagon Reino Rav Eliezer Alevi Grunhut, Machmad Tirdot Rabot Muchrachani Lavo Bekotzer Amarim. I'm going to be brief here. So he says, firstly, I want to thank you, Al Mishloach HaKuntris, for sending me the Kuntris. He doesn't say what the Kuntris is, but presumably something that Rav Kook wrote about this. The Aleha Chavat Selet, and the pages from Chavat Selet. So Rav Grunhut takes his own article, puts it in an envelope with Rav Kook's tshuva on the matter, sends it to his Rebbe, Rav David Tzvi Hofman. This is Uma Shenogea Leguf HaShe'ela. He goes straight to the bottom line. La'aniyut da'ati, in my humble opinion, Hadin im Harav Hagon Moreno Harav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen. I think Rav Kook is right. So, even though he had originally been machmir, here he changes his mind. He said, I read Rav Kook's tshuva, I think he's right. And then he explains why. And then you'll see all the way at the tail end, it's really hard to read. He says, after explaining why he wants to rely on why he thinks Rav Kook's heter makes sense, he says, the Harav Dr. Ritter, right, there's the last couple of lines on the obverse side, the side with the address on it, Me Rotterdam, right? Rabbi Ritter, right? He was a well-known Rav in Rotterdam. I can't remember his first name now. Something Leib Ritter, who was the rabbi of Rotterdam. That's a tongue twister. Ritter, the rabbi of Rotterdam, he was there for about half a century. He says, Amar, Shemoreno Rav Yitzchak Elchanan B'shut Be'er Yitzchak. Matir Shemen Sumsimen. He said, Dr. Ritter told me that Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector is Matir Shemen Sumsimen, sesame oil. Sefer Zeh eno biyadi, but I don't have that sefer in front of me now. And then he signs off. So this fills in a number of gaps. Number one, you see that he heard from Rav Ritter that this is what Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector said. So in the second tshuva, when he mentions Va'achar kach shamati, later I heard that this is what Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector said. He never saw it, and by the way, for good reason. I never saw it either because I looked in Shut Ber Yitzchak, and I ran a lot of I searched for several different terms. I don't think there is such a tshuva in Shut Ber Yitzchak. And we also see that, even though this was not in Melamed Laho'il, this was never published in Melamed Laho'il, we only have faint traces that Rav Hofman was changing his position. You see here, a full-blown retraction of his earlier position. There are still certain questions that can only be answered if we recover the original manuscript of Siman Peichet, and we can see whether the reference to Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector was added later. But at the very least, we can see three different stages in Rav Hofman's view, that over the course of about 6.5 years, or 5.5 years, between late 1903 and the spring of 1909, initially he was machmir. In the second responsum, he brings in more views. He brings in Rav Hirsch and Rav Spector, but he says, Lo mala'ani libi. I do not feel like I'm uncomfortable permitting, despite the other authorities who are matir, who are permissive. But he uses their positions in order to permit something else, meaning he uses them as what we would call a seif lehakel. And then finally, after reading Rav Kook responsum, he accepts it, and he, together with the permissive ruling of Rav Spector, he full-blown retracts his initial view. And this is emblematic of what we've seen with other cases. In other cases, it's not always He's not always machmir. He's not always mekel over time. Sometimes he's machmir over time, right? And that's, that also sort of flies in the face of how people perceive Rav David Tzvi Hoffman as some, lenient. He wasn't always lenient. There are cases where he was more machmir over time. But he was consistent. But what we can say is that he was continuously revisiting and questioning his earlier views, updating his notebook with new sources, with new information, and gradually shifting his halachic opinion. One final point that I'd like to make, and with this we'll end, is that this helps us understand what we pointed out before, that there are no names and there are no places in the writings of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, right? And that Dr. Gordis even said that he neglected to date his tshuva. He didn't neglect to date his tshuva. He purposefully didn't date his tshuva. Why? Because he didn't view the entries in his notebook as finished products, right? If there's a place and if there's a date, it means that this is a record of a particular question at a particular time. When you don't put the date in, and when you don't put the name of the addressee, then it means that at least in potential, you're maintaining it as a record of an engagement with a particular issue over the course of several years. In the grand scheme, we discussed an issue, sesame oil on Pesach. That's not the most weighty of issues. Certainly there are much more weighty issues that he dealt with over the course of his life, and we've heard about many of them today. And I apologize to members of the Kitniot Liberation Front for saying that this is not such a weighty issue. This does not provide a window, but it does provide a window into how Rav Hoffman was constantly adding sources, rethinking his views, and occasionally revising his halachic positions, whether l'kula or l'chumra. Thank you.
And that's one of the other areas that you were writing about.
One of them, yes. The other two issues that we wrote about was the question of whether a cotton ball to prevent ear infections constitutes a chatzitza when going to the mikvah, and the other one was about using specific types of contraception. We went with Kitniot.
Even though the other two questions are asked
yes,
all the time.
All the time.
But thank you.
And we wrote about them.
כן, אבל זה עדיין רלוונטי. You wanted to say something?
People, I'd rather they go first. But there are no other questions I wanted to.
No, please.
So this was great, and I learned a lot. Connecting your lecture with the previous one of Dr. Biro, he does something very similar regarding cremation. And if you look at, he has a series of tshuvot about burying ashes of cremation, and he kind of changes his mind. He does halacha l'maaseh. He goes from being machmir, and it's interesting. I think the neologue in Budapest took his sort of mainstream tshuva, but he actually has one that's even a little bit more mekel. But in the cremation case, it seemed to me that what he tried to do was, even when he changed his bottom line, he tried to be consistent with his halachic reasoning. And I'm wondering if you would say the same thing here regarding Kitniot or the cases of contraception and mochtahut, whether in those cases as well, he tries to sustain the foundational.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I think he is dealing with questions of new information, dealing with sources that he hadn't seen. Nobody is omniscient. It's a question of, do you change your mind based on response? Do you change your mind based on new sources of information that are coming to light, on what other people have written? I think that his entire halachic approach, unlike, say, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who he goes back to he barely quotes any acharonim, right? He goes back to the earliest sources, to the Gemara, right? He analyzes the Gemara, and he comes up with his whatever he comes up with. He comes up with his answer. It's based on his own fresh analysis, and he almost ignores what everybody before him. He's almost ignoring all precedent. Rav Hoffman is very sensitive to precedent. He very much sees himself, I mean, you see throughout his Shuvot, the people that he's quoting are Chatam Sofer and Ktav Sofer, Rabbi Yehuda Hassad, and of course his Rebbe Maram Shik. Between the four of them, you probably have 200 or more citations in Melamed Lahoyel, and he's very much influenced by what he perceives as the mainstream halachic view. In the case of contraception, he initially relied on a kula of the Machane Chaim, Reb Chaim Sofer, who was known for being a very almost Kana'i posek. He says, if he permits it, then okay, I can permit it too. But then there were other tshuvo that started to push back against it, like from the Netas Soreik and others. And he said, you know what, I'm not comfortable relying on this kula anymore.
We're gonna have to.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, thank you.